The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. I'll seek a readier path. Parnell. The route taken by Hawkeye lay across those sandy plains, relived by occasional valleys and swells of land which had been traversed by their party on the morning of the same day, with the baffled Magua for their guide. The sun had now fallen low toward the distant mountains, and as their journey lay through the interminable forest, the heat was no longer oppressive. Their progress, in consequence, was proportionate, and long before the twilight gathered about them, they had made good many toilsome miles on their return. The hunter, like the savage whose place he's filled, seemed to select among the blind signs of their wild route with a species of instinct, seldom abating his speed and never pausing to deliberate. A rapid and oblique glance at the moss on the trees, with an occasional upward gaze towards the setting sun, or a steady but passing look at the direction of the numerous watercourses through which he waded, were sufficient to determine his path and remove his greatest difficulties. In the meantime, the forest began to change its hues, losing that lively green which had embellished its arches in the graver light which is the usual precursor of the close of the day. While the eyes of the sisters were endeavoring to catch glimpses through the trees of the flood of golden glory which formed a glittering halo around the sun, tinging here and there with ruby streaks or bordering with narrow edgings of shining yellow, a mass of clouds that lay piled at no great distance above the western hills, Hawkeye turned suddenly, and pointing upward towards the gorgeous heavens, he spoke. "Yonder is the signal given to man to seek his food and natural rest," he said. "Better and wiser would it be if he could understand the signs of nature, and take a lesson from the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Our night, however, will be soon over, for with the moon we must be up and moving again. I remember to have fought the Maquas hereways in the first war in which I ever drew blood from man, and we threw up a work of blocks to keep the ravenous varmints from handling our scalps. If my marks do not fail me, we shall find the place a few rods further to our left." Without waiting for an assent, or indeed for any reply, the sturdy hunter moved boldly into a dense thicket of young chestnuts, shoving aside the branches of the exuberant shoots which nearly covered the ground, like a man who expected, at each step, to discover some object he had formerly known. The recollection of the scout did not deceive him. After penetrating through the brush, matted as it was with briars, for a few hundred feet, he entered an open space that surrounded a low, green hillock, which was crowned by the decayed blockhouse in question. This rude and neglected building was one of those deserted works which, having been thrown up on an emergency, had been abandoned with the disappearance of danger, and was now quietly crumbling in the solitude of the forest, neglected and nearly forgotten, like the circumstances which had caused it to be reared. Such memorials of the passage and struggles of man are yet frequent through the broad barrier of wilderness which once separated the hostile provinces, and form a species of ruins that are intimately associated with the recollections of colonial history, and which are in appropriate keeping with the gloomy character of the surrounding scenery. The roof of bark had long since fallen and mingled with the soil, but the huge logs of pine which had been hastily thrown together still preserved their relative positions, though one angle of the work was given way under the pressure and threatened a speedy downfall to the remainder of the rustic edifice. While Hayward and his companions hesitated to approach a building so decayed, Hawkeye and the Indians entered with the low walls, not only without fear, but with obvious interest. While the former surveyed the ruins, both internally and externally, with the curiosity of one whose recollections were reviving at each moment, Chingachgook related to his son, in the language of the Delawares, and with the pride of a conqueror, the brief history of the skirmish which had been fought in his youth in that secluded spot. A strain of melancholy, however, blended with his triumph, rendering his voice, as usual, soft and musical. In the meantime, the sisters gladly dismounted, and prepared to enjoy their halt in the coolness of the evening, and in a security which they believed nothing but the beasts of the forest could invade. "Would not our resting place have been more retired, my worthy friend?" demanded the more vigilant Duncan, perceiving that the scout had already finished his short survey. "Had we chosen a spot less known and one more rarely visited than this?" "Few live who know the blockhouse was ever raised," was the slow and musing answer. "'Tis not often that books are made, and narratives written of such a scrimmage as was here fought between the Mohicans and the Mohawks in a war of their own waging. I was then a yonker, and went out with the Delawares because I knowed they were a scandalized and wronged race. 40 days and 40 nights did the imps crave our blood around this pile of logs, which I designed and partly reared, being, as you'll remember, no Indian myself, but a man without a cross. The Delawares lent themselves to the work, and we made it good, 10 to 20, until our numbers were nearly equal. And then we sallied out upon the hounds, and not a man of them ever got back to tell the fate of his party. Yes, I was then young, and new to the sight of blood, and not relishing the thought that creatures who had spirits like myself should lay on the naked ground to be torn asunder by beasts or to bleach in the rains. I buried the dead with my own hands, under that very little hillock where you have placed yourselves, and no bad seat does it make neither, though it be raised by the bones of mortal men." Hayward and the sisters arose on the instant from the grassy sepulchre, nor could the two latter, notwithstanding the terrific scenes they had so recently passed through, entirely suppress an emotion of natural horror when they found themselves in such familiar contact with the grave of the dead Mohawks. The gray light, the gloomy little area of dark grass, surrounded by its border of brush, beyond which the pines rose in breathing silence, apparently into the very clouds, and the death-like stillness of the vast forest were all in unison to deepen such a sensation. "They are gone, and they are harmless," continued Hawkeye, waving his hand with a melancholy smile at their manifest alarm. "They'll never shout the war whoop nor strike a blow with the tomahawk again. And all of those who aided in placing them where they lie, Chingachgook and I are living. The brothers and family of the Mohican formed our war party, and you see before you all that are now left of his race." The eyes of the listeners involuntarily sought the forms of the Indians with a compassionate interest in their desolate fortune. Their dark persons were still to be seen within the shadows of the blockhouse, the son listening to the relation of his father with that sort of intenseness which would be created by a narrative that redounded so much to the honor of those whose names he had long revered for their courage and savage virtues. "I thought the Delawares a pacific people," said Duncan, "and that they never waged war in person, trusting the defense of their hands to these very Mohawks that you slew." "'Tis true in part," returned the scout, "and yet at the bottom 'tis a wicked lie. Such a treaty was made in ages gone by, through the deviltries of the Dutchers who wished to disarm the natives that had the best right to this country, where they had settled themselves. The Mohicans, though part of the same nation, having to deal with the English, never entered into the silly bargain, but kept to their manhood, as in truth did the Delawares when their eyes were opened to their folly. You see before you a chief of the great Mohican Sagamores. Once his family could chase their deer over tracts of country wider than which belongs to the Albany Pataroon, without crossing brook or hill that was not their own. But what is left of their descendant? He might find his 6 feet of earth when God chooses and keep it in peace, perhaps, if he has a friend who will take the pains to sink his head so low that the plowshares cannot reach it. Enough, said Hayward, apprehensive that the subject might lead to discussion that would interrupt the harmony so necessary to the preservation of his fair companions. We have journeyed far, and few among us are blessed with forms like that of yours, which seem to know neither fatigue nor weakness. The sinews and bones of a man carry me through it all, said the hunter, surveying his muscular limbs with a simplicity that betrayed the honest pleasure the compliment afforded him. There are larger and heavier men to be found in the settlements, but you might travel many days in a city before you could meet one able to walk 50 miles without stopping to take breath, or who has kept the hounds within hearing during a chase of ours. However, as flesh and blood are not always the same, it is quite reasonable to suppose that the gentle ones are willing to rest after all they have seen and done this day. Uncas, clear out the spring while your father and I make a cover for the tender heads of these chestnut shoots and a bed of grass and leaves. The dialogue ceased while the hunter and his companions busied themselves in preparations for the comfort and protection of those they guided. A spring, which many long years before had induced the natives to select the place for their temporary fortification, was soon cleared of leaves, and a fountain of crystal gushed from the bed, diffusing its waters over the verdant hillock. A corner of the building was then roofed in such a manner as to exclude the heavy dew of the climate, and piles of sweet shrubs and dried leaves were laid beneath it for the sisters to repose on. While the diligent woodsmen were employed in this manner, Cora and Alice partook of that refreshment which duty required much more than inclination prompted them to accept. They then retired within the walls, and first offered up their thanksgivings for past mercies, and petitioning for a continuance of the divine favor throughout the coming night, they laid their tender forms on the fragrant couch, and in spite of recollections and forebodings, soon sank into those slumbers which nature so imperiously demanded, and which were sweetened by hopes for the morrow. Duncan had prepared himself to pass the night in watchfulness near them, just without the ruin, but the scout, perceiving his intention, pointed toward Chingachgook as he coolly disposed his own person on the grass and said, "The eyes of a white man are too heavy and too blind for such a watch as this. The Mohican will be our sentinel, therefore let us sleep." "I proved myself a sluggard on my post during the past night," said Hayward, "and have less need of a repose than you, who did more credit to the character of a soldier. Let all the party seek their rest, then, while I hold the guard." "If we lay among the white tents of the 60th and in front of an enemy like the French, I could not ask for a better watchman," returned the scout. "But in the darkness and among the signs of the wilderness, your judgment would be like the folly of a child, and your vigilance thrown away. Do then, like Uncas and myself, sleep, and sleep in safety." Hayward perceived, in truth, that the younger Indian had thrown his form on the side of the hillock while they were talking, like one who sought to make the most of the time allotted to rest, and that his example had been followed by David, whose voice literally clove to his jaws with the fever of his wound, heightened as it was by their toilsome march. Unwilling to prolong a useless discussion, the young man affected to comply by posting his back against the logs of the blockhouse in a half-recumbent posture, though resolutely determined in his own mind not to close an eye until he had delivered his precious charge into the arms of Monroe himself. Hawkeye, believing he had prevailed, soon fell asleep, and a silence as deep as the solitude in which they had found it pervaded the retired spot. For many minutes Duncan succeeded in keeping his senses on the alert and alive to every moaning sound that arose from the forest. His vision became more acute as the shades of evening settled on the place, and even after the stars were glimmering above his head, he was able to distinguish the recumbent form of his companions as they lay stretched on the grass, and to note the person of Chingachgook, who sat upright and motionless as one of the trees which formed the dark barrier on every side. He still heard the gentle breathings of the sisters, who lay within a few feet of him, and not a leaf was ruffled by the passing air of which his ear did not detect the whispering sound. At length, however, the mournful notes of a whippoorwill became blended with the moanings of an owl. His heavy eyes occasionally sought the bright rays of the stars, and he then fancied he saw them through the fallen lids. At instants of momentary wakefulness, he mistook a bush for his associate sentinel. His head next sank upon his shoulder, which, in its turn, sought the support of the ground, and finally his whole person became relaxed and pliant, and the young man sank into a deep sleep, dreaming that he was a knight of ancient chivalry, holding his midnight vigils before the tent of a recaptured princess, whose favor he did not despair of gaining by such a proof of devotion and watchfulness. How long the tired Duncan lay in this insensible state he never knew himself, but his slumbering visions had been long lost in total forgetfulness when he was awakened by a light tap on the shoulder. Aroused by this signal, slight as it was, he sprang upon his feet with the confused recollection of the self-imposed duty he had assumed with the commencement of the night. "Who comes?" he demanded, feeling for his sword at the place where it usually suspended. "Speak! Friend or enemy?" "Friend," replied the low voice of Chingachgook, who, pointing upward at the luminary which was shedding its mild light through the opening in the trees, directly in the bivouac, immediately added in his rude English, "Moon comes and white man's fort far, far off. Time to move, when sleep shuts both eyes of the Frenchman." "You say true. Call up your friends, and bridle the horses while I prepare my own companions for the march." We are awake, Duncan," said the soft, silvery tones of Alice within the building, "and ready to travel very fast after so refreshing a sleep. But you have watched through the tedious night in our behalf, after having endured so much fatigue the livelong day." "Say rather I would have watched, but my treacherous eyes betrayed me. Twice I have proved myself unfit for the trust I bear." "Nay, Duncan, deny it not," interrupted the smiling Alice. Issuing from the shadows of the building into the light of the moon, in all the loveliness of her refreshed beauty. "I know you to be a heedless one, when self is the object of your care, and but too vigilant in the favor of others. Can we not tarry here a little longer while you find the rest you need? Cheerfully, most cheerfully, will Cora and I keep the vigils, while you and all these brave men endeavor to snatch a little sleep." "If shame could cure me of my drowsiness, I should never close an eye again," said the uneasy youth, gazing at the ingenious countenance of Alice, where, however, in its sweet solicitude, he read nothing to confirm his half-awakened suspicion. "It is but true, too true, that after leading you into danger by my heedlessness, I have not even the merit of guarding your pillows as should become a soldier." "No one but Duncan himself should accuse Duncan of such a weakness. Go then and sleep. Believe me, neither of us, weak girls as we are, will betray our watch." The young man was relieved from the awkwardness of making any further protestations of his own demerits by an exclamation from Chingachgook and the attitude of riveted attention assumed by his son. "The Mohicans near an enemy," whispered Hawkeye, who, by his time, in common with the whole party, was awake and stirring. "They scent danger in the wind." "God forbid!" exclaimed Hayward. "Surely we have had enough of bloodshed." While he spoke, however, the young soldier seized his rifle, and advancing towards the front, prepared to atone for his venial remissness by freely exposing his life in defense of those he attended. "'Tis some creature of the forest prowling around us in quest of food," he said, in a whisper, as soon as the low and apparently distant sounds which had startled the Mohicans reached his own ears. "Hist!" returned the attentive scout. "'Tis man. Even I can now tell his tread, poor as my senses are when compared to an Indian's. That scampering Huron has fallen in with one of Montcalm's outlying parties, and they have stuck upon our trail. I shouldn't like myself to spill more human blood in this spot," he added, looking around with anxiety in his features at the dim objects by which he was surrounded. "But what must be must. Lead the horses into the blockhouse, Uncas, and friends, do you follow to the same shelter. Poor and old as it is, it offers a cover, and has rung with the crack of a rifle afore tonight." He was instantly obeyed, the Mohicans leading the Narragansetts within the ruin, whither the whole party repaired with the most guarded silence. The sound of approaching footsteps were now too distinctly audible to leave any doubts as to the nature of the interruption. They were soon mingled with voices calling to each other in an Indian dialect which the hunter, in a whisper, affirmed to Hayward was the language of the Hurons. When the party reached the point where the horses had entered the thicket which surrounded the blockhouse, they were evidently at fault, having lost those marks which, until that moment, had directed their pursuit. It would seem by their voices that 20 men were soon collected at that one spot, mingling their different opinions and advice in noisy clamor. "The knaves know our weakness," whispered Hawkeye, who stood by the side of Hayward in deep shade, looking through an opening in the logs. "Or they wouldn't indulge their idleness in such a squaw's march. Listen to the reptiles. Each man among them seems to have 2 tongues and but a single leg." Duncan, brave as he was in the combat, could not, in such a moment of painful suspense, make any reply to the cool and characteristic remark of the scout. He only grasped his rifle more firmly and fastened his eyes upon the narrow opening, through which he gazed upon the moonlight view with increasing anxiety. The deeper tones of one who spoke as having authority were next heard, amid a silence that denoted the respect with which his orders, or rather advice, was received. After which, by the rustling of leaves and crackling of dried twigs, it was apparent the savages were separating in pursuit of the lost trail. Fortunately for the pursued, the light of the moon, while it shed a flood of mild luster upon the little area around the ruin, was not sufficiently strong to penetrate the deep arches of the forest, where the objects still lay in deceptive shadow. The search proved fruitless, for so short and sudden had been the passage from the faint path the travelers had journeyed into the thicket, that every trace of their footsteps was lost in the obscurity of the woods. It was not long, however, before the restless savages were heard beating the bush and gradually approaching the inner edge of that dense border of young chestnuts which encircled the little area. "They are coming," muttered Hayward, endeavoring to thrust his rifle through the chink in the logs. "Let us fire on their approach." "Keep everything in the shade," returned the scout. "The snapping of a flint, or even the smell of a single kernel of the brimstone, would bring the hungry varlets upon us in a body. Should it please God that we must give battle for the scalps, trust the experience of men who know the ways of the savages, and who are not often backward when the war whoop is howled." Duncan cast his eyes behind him, and saw that the trembling sisters were cowering in the far corner of the building, while the Mohicans stood in the shadow, like 2 upright posts, ready, and apparently willing, to strike when the blow should be needed. Curbing his impatience, he again looked out upon the area and awaited the result in silence. At that instant the thicket opened, and a tall and armed Huron advanced a few paces into the open space. As he gazed upon the silent blockhouse, The moon fell upon his swarthy countenance and betrayed its surprise and curiosity. He made the exclamation which usually accompanies its former emotion in an Indian, and, calling in a low voice, soon drew a companion to his side. These children of the woods stood together for several moments, pointing at the crumbling edifice and conversing in the unintelligible language of their tribe. They then approached, though with slow and cautious steps, pausing every instant to look at the building, like startled deer whose curiosity struggled powerfully with their awakened apprehensions for their mastery. The foot of one of them suddenly rested on the mound, and he stopped to examine its nature. At this moment, Hayward observed that the scout loosened his knife in its sheath and lowered the muzzle of his rifle. Imitating these movements, the young man prepared himself for the struggle which now seemed inevitable. The savages were so near that the least motion in one of the horses, or even a breath louder than common, would have betrayed the fugitives. But in discovering the character of the mound, the attention of the Hurons appeared directed to a different object. They spoke together, and the sound of their voices were low and solemn, as if influenced by a reverence that was deeply blended with awe. Then they drew warily back, keeping their eyes riveted on the ruin, as if they expected to see the apparitions of the dead issue from its silent walls, until, having reached the boundary of the area, they moved slowly into the thicket and disappeared. Hawkeye dropped the breech of his rifle to the earth and, drawing a long, free breath, exclaimed in an audible whisper, "Aye, they respect the dead, and it has this time saved their own lives, and it may be the lives of better men, too." Hayward lent his attention for a single moment to his companion, and but without replying, he again turned towards those who had just interested him more. He heard the two Hurons leave the bushes, and it was soon plain that all the pursuers were gathered about them in deep attention to their report. After a few minutes of earnest and solemn dialogue, altogether different from the noisy clamor with which they had first collected about the spot, the sounds grew fainter and more distant, and finally were lost in the depths of the forest. Hawkeye waited until a signal from the listening Chingachgook assured him that every sound from the tiring party was completely swallowed by the distance, when he motioned to Hayward to lead forth the horses and to assist the sisters into their saddles. The instant this was done, they issued through the broken gateway, and stealing out by a direction opposite to the one by which they entered, they quitted the spot, the sisters casting furtive glances at the silent grave and crumbling ruin, as they left the soft light of the moon to bury themselves in the gloom of the woods. Chapter 14. Garde. Qui est là? Puck. Paysans, pauvres gens de France. King Henry VI. During the rapid movement from the blockhouse and until the party was buried deeply in the forest, each individual was too much interested in the escape to hazard a word even in whispers. The scout resumed his post in advance, though his steps, after he had thrown a safe distance between himself and his enemies, were more deliberate than in their previous march, in consequence of his utter ignorance of the localities of the surrounding woods. More than once he halted to consult with his confederates, the Mohicans, pointing upwards at the moon and examining the barks of the trees with care. In these brief pauses, Hayward and the sisters listened, with senses rendered doubly acute by the danger, to detect any symptoms which might announce the proximity of their foes. At such moments, it seemed as if a vast range of country lay buried in eternal sleep, not the least sound arising from the forest, unless it was the distant and scarcely audible rippling of a watercourse. Birds, beasts, and man appeared to slumber alike, if indeed any of the latter were to be found in that wide tract of wilderness. But the sounds of the rivulet, feeble and murmuring as they were, relieved the guides at once from no trifling embarrassment, and toward it they immediately held their way. When the banks of the little stream were gained, Hawkeye made another halt, and taking the moccasins from his feet, he invited Hayward and Gamut to follow his example. He then entered the water, and for nearly an hour they traveled in the bed of the brook, leaving no trail. The moon had already sunk into an immense pile of black clouds, which lay impending above the western horizon when they issued from the low and devious watercourse to rise again to the light and level of the sandy but wooded plain. Here the scout seemed to be once more at home, for he held on his way with the certainty and diligence of a man who moved in the security of his own knowledge. The path soon became more uneven, and the travelers could plainly perceive that the mountains drew nigher to them on each hand, and that they were, in truth, about entering one of their gorges. Suddenly, Hawkeye made a pause, and, waiting until he was joined by the whole party, he spoke, though in tones so low and cautious that they added to the solemnity of his words, in the quiet and darkness of the place.
It is easy to know the pathways, and to find the licks and watercourses of the wilderness, he said. But who that saw this spot could venture to say that a mighty army was at rest among yonder silent trees and barren mountains?
"We are, then, at no great distance from William Henry?" said Hayward, advancing nigher to the scout.
"It is yet a long and weary path, and when and where to strike it is now our greatest difficulty. See," he said, pointing through the trees towards a spot where a little basin of water reflected the stars from its placid bosom. "Here is the Bloody Pond, and I am on ground that I have not only often traveled, but over which I have fought the enemy from the rising to the setting sun."
"Ha! That sheet of dull and dreary water, then, is the sepulchre of the brave man who fell in the contest. I have heard it named, but never have I stood on its banks before."
3 battles did we make the Dutch Frenchmen in a day, continued Hawkeye, pursuing his own train of thoughts rather than replying on the remark of Duncan.
Note: Baron Dieskau, a German, in the service of France. A few years previously to the period of this tale, this officer was defeated by Sir William Johnston of Johnstown, New York, on the shores of Lake George.
He met us hard by in our outward march to ambush his advance, and scattered us like driven deer through the defile to the shores of Horican. Then we rallied behind our fallen trees, and made head against him, under Sir William, who was made Sir William for that very deed, and well did we pay him for the disgrace of the morning. Hundreds of Frenchmen saw the sun that day for the last time, and even their leader, Dieskau himself, fell into our hands, so cut and torn with the lead that he was gone back to his own country, unfit for further acts in war.
"'Twas a noble repulse," exclaimed Hayward in the heat of his youthful ardor. "The fame of it reached us early in our southern army."
"Aye, but it did not end there. I was sent by Major Effingham, at Sir William's own bidding, to outflank the French, and carry the tidings of their disaster across the portage to the fort on the Hudson. Just hereaway, where you see the trees rise into a mountain swell, I met a party coming down to our aid, and I led them where the enemy were taking their meal, little dreaming that they had not finished that bloody work of the day."
"And you surprised them?"
"If death can be a surprise to men who are thinking only of the cravings of their appetites. We gave them but little breathing time, for they had borne hard upon us in the fight of the morning, and there were few in our party who had not lost friend or relative by their hands."
"When all was over, the dead, as some say the dying, were cast into that little pond. Those eyes have seen its waters colored with blood, as natural water never yet flowed from the bowels of the earth."
"It was a convenient and, I trust, will prove a peaceful grave for a soldier. You have then seen much service on this frontier."
"Aye," said the scout, erecting his tall person with an air of military pride.
"There are not many echoes among these hills that haven't rung with the crack of my rifle, nor is there the space of a square mile atwixt Horican and the river that Killdeer hasn't dropped a living body on it, be it enemy or be it a brute beast. As for the grave there being as quiet as you mention, it is another matter. There are in them the camp who say and think, man, to lie still, should not be buried while the breath is in his body, and certain it is that in the hurry of that evening the doctors had but little time to say who was living and who was dead. Hist! See you nothing walking on the shore of the pond? 'Tis not probable that any are as houseless as ourselves in this dreary forest. Such as he may care but little for house and shelter, as night dew can never wet a body that passes its days in the water, returned the scout, grasping the shoulder of Hayward with such a convulsive strength as to make the young soldier painfully sensible how much superstitious terror had gotten the master of a man usually so dauntless. By heaven, there is a human form, and it approaches. Stand to your arms, my friends, for we know not whom we encounter. Que vive? Demanded a stern, quick voice which sounded like a challenge from another world, issuing out of that solitary and solemn place. Who says it? Whispered the scout. It speaks neither Indian nor English. Que vive? Repeated the same voice, which was quickly followed by the rattling of arms and a menacing attitude. France! Cried Hayward, advancing from the shadow of the trees to the shore of the pond, within a few yards of the sentinel. Devenez-vous, allez-vous d'assez bonheur? Demanded the grenadier in the language, with the accent of a man from old France. Je viens de la difficulté me coucher. Êtes vous l'officier du roi? Sans doute, mon camarade. Mais prince du provincial? Je suis capitaine des chasseurs. Hayward well knew that the other was of a regiment in the line. J'ai ici avec moi les filles des commandants de la fortification. Tu es-tu prendre par l'air? Je les fait prisonniers près leur tour fort. Et je le conduis au général. Ma foi, les dames, je suis fâché pour vous, exclaimed the young soldier, touching his cap with grace. Mais, fortune de guerre, vous traversez notre journal un brave homme, et bien poli avec les dames. C'est la caractère des gens de guerre, said Cora, with admirable self-possession. Adieu, mon ami, je vous souhaite un devoir plus agréable à remplir. The soldier made a low and humble acknowledgment for her civility, and Hayward, adding a bonne nuit, mon camarade, they moved deliberately forward, leaving the sentinel pacing the banks of the silent pond, little suspecting an enemy of so much effrontery, and humming to himself those words which were recalled to his mind by the sight of women, and perhaps by recollections of his own and beautiful France. Vive la vie, vive l'amour. Side note, I apologize. I don't speak any French. I probably butchered the heck out of that. I apologize. "'Tis well you understood the knave," whispered the scout, when they had gained a little distance from the place, and letting his rifle fall into the hollow of his arm again. "I soon saw that he was one of the uneasy Frenchers, and well for him that his speech was friendly and his wishes kind, or a place might have been found for his bones among those of his countrymen." He was interrupted by a long and heavy groan which arose from the little basin, as though, in truth, the spirit of the departed lingered about their watery sepulchre. "Surely it was of flesh," continued the scout. "No spirit could handle its arm so steadily." "It was of flesh, but whether the poor fellow still belongs to this world may well be doubted," said Hayward, glancing his eyes around him and missing Chingachgook from their little band. Another groan, more faint than the former, was succeeded by a heavy and sullen plunge into the water, and all was still again, as if the borders of the dreary pool had never been awakened from the silence of creation. While they yet hesitated in uncertainty, the form of the Indian was seen gliding out of the thicket. As the chief rejoined them, with one hand he attached the reeking scalp of the unfortunate young Frenchman to his girdle,
and with the other he replaced the knife and tomahawk that had drunk his blood. He then took his wonted station with the air of a man who believed he had done a deed of merit. The scout dropped one end of his rifle to the earth, and leaning his hands on the other, he stood musing in profound silence. Then, shaking his head in a mournful manner, he muttered, "'T would have been cruel and unhuman act for a white-skin, but 'tis the gifted nature of an Indian, and I suppose it should not be denied. I could wish, though, it had befallen an accursed Mingo, rather than that gay young boy from the old countries." "Enough," said Hayward, apprehensive the unconscious sisters might comprehend the nature of the detention, and conquering his disgust by a train of reflections very much like that of the hunter. "'Tis done, and though better it were left undone, cannot be amended. You see, we are too obviously within the sentinels of the enemy. What course do you propose to follow?"
"Yes," said Hawkeye, rousing himself again. "'Tis as you say. Too late to harbor further thoughts about it. Aye, the French have gathered around the fort in good earnest, and we have a delicate needle to thread in passing them."
"And but little time to do it in," added Hayward, glancing his eyes upward toward the bank of vapor that concealed the setting moon.
"And little time to do it in," repeated the scout. "The thing may be done in two fashions. By the help of Providence, without which it may not be done at all."
"Name them quickly, for time presses."
"One would be to dismount the gentle ones and let their beasts range the plain. By sending the Mohicans in front, we might then cut a lane through their sentries and enter the fort over the dead bodies."
"It will not do, it will not do," interrupted the generous Hayward. "A soldier might force his way in this manner, but never with such a convoy."
"'Twould be indeed a bloody path for such tender feet to wade in," returned the equally reluctant scout. "But I thought it befitting my manhood to name it. We must then turn in our trail and get without the line of their lookouts, when we will bend short to the west and into the mountains, where I could hide you, so that all the devil's hounds in Montcalm's pay would be thrown off the scents for months to come."
"Let it be done, and that instantly." Further words were unnecessary, for Hawkeye, merely uttering the mandate to follow, moved along the route by which they had just entered their present critical and even dangerous situation. Their progress, like their late dialogue, was guarded and without noise, for none knew at what moment a passing patrol or crouching picket of the enemy might rise upon their path. As they held their silent way along the margin of the pond, again Hayward and the scouts stole furtive glances at the appalling dreariness. They looked in vain for the form they had so recently seen stalking along in silent shores, while a low and regular wash of the little waves, by announcing that the waters were not yet subsided, furnished a frightful memorial of the deed of blood they had just witnessed. Like all that passing and gloomy scene, the low basin, however, quickly melted in the darkness and became blended with the mass of black objects in the rear of the travelers. Hawkeye soon deviated from the line of their retreat, and striking off towards the mountains which form the western boundary of the narrow plain, he led his followers, with swift steps, deep within the shadows that were cast from their high and broken summits. The route was now painful, lying over ground ragged with rocks, and intersected with ravines, and their progress proportionally slow. Bleak and black hills lay on every side of them, compensating in some degree for the additional toil of the march by the sense of security they imparted. At length the party began slowly to rise a steep and rugged ascent, by a path that curiously wound among rocks and trees, avoiding the one and supported by the other, in a manner that showed it had been devised by men long practiced in the arts of the wilderness. As they gradually rose from the level of the valleys, the thick darkness which usually precedes the approach of the day began to disperse, and objects which were seen in the plain and palpable colors which they had been gifted by nature. When they issued from the stunted woods which clung to the barren sides of the mountain upon a flat and mossy rock that formed its summit, they met the morning, and it came blushing above the green pines of a hill that lay on the opposite side of the valley of the Horican. The scout now told the sisters to dismount, and taking the bridles from their mouths and the saddles off the backs of the jaded beasts, he turned them loose to glean a scanty subsistence among the shrubs and meager herbage of that elevated region.
"Go," he said, "and seek your food where nature gives it to you, and beware that you become not food to ravenous wolves yourselves among these hills."
"Have we no further need of them?" demanded Hayward.
"See, and judge with your own eyes,"
said the scout, advancing toward the eastern brow of the mountain, whither he beckoned for the whole party to follow.
"If it was as easy to look into the heart of man as to spy out the nakedness of Montcalm's camp from his spot, hypocrites would grow scarce, and the cunning of a Mingo might prove a losing game compared to the honesty of a Delaware."
When the travelers reached the verge of the precipice, they saw at a glance the truth of the scout's declaration, and the admirable foresight with which he had led them to their commanding station. The mountain on which they stood, elevated perhaps 1,000 feet in the air, was a high cone that rose a little in advance of that range which stretches for miles along the western shores of the lake. Until meeting its sister, miles beyond the water, it ran off toward the Canadas, in confused and broken masses of rock, thinly sprinkled with evergreens. Immediately, at the feet of the party, the southern shore of the Horican swept in a broad semicircle from mountain to mountain, marking a wide strand that soon rose into an uneven and somewhat elevated plain. To the north stretched the limpid and, as it appeared from that dizzy height, the narrow sheet of the Holy Lake, indented with numberless bays, embellished by fantastic headlands, and dotted with countless islands. At the distance of a few leagues, the bed of the water became lost among mountains, or was wrapped in the masses of vapor that came slowly rolling along their bosom before a light morning air. But a narrow opening between the crests of the hills pointed out the passage by which they found their way still further north, to spread their pure and ample sheets again, before pouring out their tribute into the distant Champlain. To the south stretched the defile, or rather broken plain so often mentioned. For several miles in this direction the mountains appeared reluctant to yield their dominion, but within reach of the eye they diverged, and finally melted into the level and sandy lands across which we have accompanied our adventurers in their double journey. Along both ranges of hills, which bounded the opposite side of the lake and valley, clouds of light vapor were rising in spiral wreaths from the uninhabited woods, looking like the smoke of hidden cottages, or rolling lazy down the declivities to mingle with the fogs of the lower land. A single solitary snow-white cloud floated above the valley and marked the spot beneath which lay the silent pool of the Bloody Pond. Directly on the shore of the lake, and nearer to its western than its eastern margin, lay the extensive earthen ramparts and low buildings of William Henry. Two of the sweeping bastions appeared to rest on the water which washed their bases, while a deep ditch and extensive morasses guarded its other sides and angles. The land had been cleared of wood for a reasonable distance round the work, but every other part of the scene lay in a green livery of nature, except where the limpid water mellowed the view, or the bold rocks thrust their black and naked heads above the undulating outline of the mountain ranges. In its front might be seen the scattered sentinels, who held a weary watch against the numerous foes, and within the walls themselves the travelers looked down upon men still drowsy with the night of vigilance. Toward the southeast, but in immediate contact with the fort, was an entrenched camp, posted on a rocky eminence that would have been far more eligible for the work itself, in which Hawkeye pointed out the presence of those auxiliary regiments that had so recently left the Hudson in their company. From the woods, a little further to the south, rose numerous dark and lurid smokes that were easily to be distinguished from the purer exhalations of the springs, and which the scout also showed to Hayward as evidences that the enemy lay in force in that direction. But the spectacle which most concerned the young soldier was on the western bank of the lake, though quite near to its southern termination. On a strip of land which appeared from his strand too narrow to contain such an army, but which, in truth, extended many hundreds of yards from the shores of the Horican to the base of the mountain, were to be seen the white tents and military engines of an encampment of 10,000 men. Batteries were already thrown up in their front, and even while the spectators above them were looking down, with such different emotions, on a scene which lay like a map beneath their feet, the roar of artillery rose from the valley and passed off in thundering echoes along the eastern hills.
"Morning is just touching them below," said the deliberate and musing scout, "and the watchers have a mind to wake up the sleepers by the sound of cannon. We are a few hours too late. Montcalm has already filled the woods with his accursed Iroquois."
"The place is indeed invested," returned Duncan, "but there is no expedient by which we may enter. Capture in the works would be far preferable to falling again into the hands of roving Indians."
"See!"
exclaimed the scout, unconsciously directing the attention of Cora to the quarters of her own father.
"How that shot has made the stones fly from the side of the commandant's house. Aye, these Frenchers will pull it to pieces faster than it was put together, solid and thick though it may be."
"Hayward, I sicken at the sight of danger that I cannot share," said the undaunted but anxious daughter. "Let us go to Montcalm and demand admission. He dare not deny a child the boon."
"You would scarce find the tent of the Frenchman with the hair on your head," said the blunt scout. "If I had but one of the 10,000 boats which lie empty along that shore, it might be done. Ha! Here will be soon an end of the firing, for yonder comes a fog that will turn day to night and make an Indian arrow more dangerous than a molded cannon. Now, if you are equal to the work and will follow, I will make a push, for I long to get down into that camp, if it only be to scatter some Mingo dogs that I see lurking on the skirts of yonder thicket of birch."
"We are equal," said Cora firmly. "On such an errand we will follow to any danger." The scout turned to her with a smile of honest and cordial approbation as he answered,
"I wish I had 1,000 men of brawny limbs and quick eyes that feared death as little as you. I'd send them jabbering Frenchers back into their den again afore the week was ended, howling like so many fettered hounds or hungry wolves. But stir," he added, turning from her to the rest of the party. "The fog comes rolling down so fast we shall have but just the time to meet it on the plain and use it as a cover. Remember, if any accident should befall me, to keep the air blowing on your left cheeks, or rather follow the Mohicans. They had sent their way, be it in any day or be it the night."
He then waved his hand for them to follow and threw themselves down the steep declivity with free but careful footsteps. Hayward assisted the sisters to descend, and in a few minutes they were all far down a mountain whose sides they had climbed with so much toil and pain. The direction taken by Hawkeye soon brought the travelers to the level of the plain, nearly opposite to a sally-port in the western curtain of the fort, which lay itself at the distance of about half a mile from the point where he halted to allow Duncan to come up with his charge. In their eagerness, and favored by the nature of the ground, they had anticipated the fog, which was rolling heavily down the lake, and it became necessary to pause until the mists had wrapped the camp and the enemy in their fleecy mantle. The Mohicans profited by the delay to steal out of the woods and to make a survey of surrounding objects. They were followed at a little distance by the scout, with the view to profit early by their report, and to obtain some faint knowledge for himself of the more immediate localities. In a very few moments he returned with face reddened with vexation while he muttered his disappointment in words of no very gentle import.
"Here has the cutting Frenchman been posting a picket directly in our path," he said, "redskins and white, and we shall be as likely to fall into their midst as to pass them in the fog."
"Cannot we make a circuit to avoid the danger?" asked Hayward, "and come into our path again when it is past?"
"Who that once bends from the line of his march in a fog can tell when or how it find it again. The mists of Horican are not like the curls from a peace pipe, or the smoke which settles above a mosquito fire."
He was yet speaking when a crashing sound was heard, and a cannonball entered the thicket, striking the body of a sapling and rebounding to the earth, its force being much expended by its previous resistance. The Indians followed instantly like busy attendants on the terrible messenger, and Uncas commenced speaking earnestly and with much action in the Delaware tongue.
"It may be so, lad,"
muttered the scout, when he had ended.
"For desperate fevers are not to be treated like a toothache. Come, then, the fog is shutting in."
"Stop!" cried Hayward. "First explain your expectations."
"'Tis soon done, and a small hope it is. But it is better than nothing. This shot that you see," added the scout, kicking the harmless iron with his foot, "has plowed the earth in its road from the fort, and we shall hunt for the furrow it has made, when all the other signs may fail. No more words, but follow, or the fog may leave us in the middle of our path, a mark for both armies to shoot at."
Hayward, perceiving that, in fact, a crisis had arrived, when acts were more required than words, placed himself between the sisters, and drew them swiftly forward, keeping the dim figure of their leader in his eye. It was soon apparent that Hawkeye had not magnified the power of the fog, for before they had proceeded 20 yards, it was difficult for the different individuals of the party to distinguish each other in the vapor. They had made their little circuit to the left and were already inclining again toward the right, having, as Hayward thought, got over nearly half the distance to the friendly works, when his ears were saluted with the fierce summons, apparently within 20 feet of them, of "Qui va là?"
"Push on,"
whispered the scout, once more bending to the left.
"Push on,"
repeated Hayward, when the summons was renewed by a dozen voices, each of which seemed changed with menace. "C'est moi!" cried Duncan, dragging rather than leading those he supported swiftly onward. "Bete? Qui? Moi? Ami de la France. Tu m'appelles l'air de l'ennemi de la France. Alors oui, pardon, je te ferai ami du diable. Non. Fui, camarades, fui." The order was instantly obeyed, and the fog was stirred by the explosion of 50 muskets. Happily, the aim was bad, and the bullets cut the air in the direction a little different from that taken by the fugitives, though still so nigh them that, to the unpracticed ears of David and the two females, it appeared as if they whistled within a few inches of the organs. The outcry was renewed, and the order, not only to fire again, but to pursue, was too plainly audible. When Hayward briefly explained the meaning of the words they heard, Hawkeye halted and spoke with quick decision and great firmness.
"Let us deliver our fire," he said. "They will believe it a sortie and give way, or they will wait for reinforcements."
The scheme was well conceived, but failed in its effects. The instant the French heard the pieces, it seemed as if the plain was alive with men, muskets rattling along its whole extent from the shores of the lake to the furthest boundary of the woods. "We shall draw the entire army upon us and bring on a general assault," said Duncan. "Lead on, my friend, for your own life and ours." The scout seemed willing to comply, but in the hurry of the moment and in the change of position, he had lost the direction. In vain he turned either cheek toward the light air, then they felt equally cool. In this dilemma, Uncas lighted on the furrow of the cannonball, where it had cut the ground in 3 adjacent anthills.
"Give me the range," said Hawkeye,
bending to catch a glimpse of the direction, and then instantly moving onward. Cries, oaths, voices calling to each other, and the reports of muskets were now quick and incessant, and, apparently, on every side of them. Suddenly, a strong glare of light flashed across the scene. The fog rolled upwards in thick wreaths, and several cannons belched across the plain, and the roar was thrown heavily back from the bellowing echoes of the mountain.
"'Tis from the fort!"
exclaimed Hawkeye, turning short on his tracks.
"And we, like stricken fools, were rushing to the woods under the very knives of the Maquas."
The instant their mistake was rectified, the whole party retraced the area with the utmost diligence. Duncan willingly relinquished the support of Cora to the arm of Uncas, and Cora as readily accepted the welcome assistance. Men, hot and angry in pursuit, were evidently on their footsteps, and each instant threatened their capture, if not their destruction. "Point the courtier going!" cried an eager pursuer who seemed to direct the operations of the enemy.
"Stand firm and be ready, my gallant 60ths!"
suddenly exclaimed a voice above them.
"Wait to see the enemy! Fire low and sweep the glacis!"
"Father! Father!" exclaimed a piercing cry from out of the mist. "It is I, Alice, thy own Elsie. Spare, oh, save your daughters!"
"Hold!"
shouted the former speaker, in the awful tones of parental agony, the sound reaching even to the woods and rolling back in solemn echo.
"'Tis she! God has restored me to my children. Throw open the sally-port. To the field, 60ths, to the field! Pull not a trigger, lest ye kill my lambs. Drive off these dogs of France with your steel."
Duncan heard the grating of the rusty hinges, and darting to the spot, directed by the sound, he met a long line of dark red warriors passing swiftly toward the glacis. He knew them for their own battalion of the Royal Americans, and flying to their head, soon swept every trace of pursuers from before the works. For an instant, Cora and Alice had stood trembling and bewildered by this unexpected desertion. But before either had leisure for speech or even thought, an officer of gigantic frame, whose locks were bleached with years in service, but whose air of military grandeur had been rather softened than destroyed by time, rushed out of the body of mist and folded them to his bosom with large, scalding tears rolling down his pale and wrinkled cheeks, and he exclaimed in a peculiar accent of Scotland,
"For this I thank thee, Lord. Let danger come as it will, thy servant is now prepared."
Chapter 15. Then go we in to know his embassy, which I could, with ready guess, declare, before the Frenchmen speak a word of it. King Henry V. A few succeeding days were passed amid the privations, the uproar, and the dangers of the siege, which was vigorously pressed by a power against whose approaches Monroe possessed no competent means of resistance. It appears as if Webb, with his army, which lay slumbering on the banks of the Hudson, had utterly forgotten the strait to which his countrymen were reduced. Montcalm had filled the woods of the portage with his savages, every yell and whoop from whom rang through the British encampment, chilling the hearts of men who were already but too much disposed to magnify the danger. Not so, however, with the besieged. Animated by the words and stimulated by the examples of their leaders, they had found their courage and maintained their ancient reputation with a zeal that did justice to the stern character of their commander. As if satisfied with the toil of marching through the wilderness to encounter his enemy, the French general, though of approved skill, had neglected to seize the adjacent mountains, which the besieged might have been exterminated with impunity, and which, in the more modern warfare of the country, would not have been neglected for a single hour. This sort of contempt for eminences, or rather dread of the labor of ascending them, might have been termed the besetting weakness of the warfare of that period. It originated in the simplicity of the Indian contests, in which, from the nature of the combats and the density of the forests, fortresses were rare and artillery next to useless. The carelessness engendered engendered by these usages descended even to the War of the Revolution and lost the states the important fortress of Ticonderoga, opening a way for the army of Burgoyne into what was then the bosom of the country. We look back at this ignorance or infatuation, whichever it may be called, with wonder, knowing that the neglect of an eminence whose difficulties, like those of Mount Defiance, had been so greatly exaggerated, would, at the present time, prove fatal to the reputation of the engineer who had planned the works at their base, or to that of the general whose lot it was to defend them. The tourist, the valetudinarian, or the amateur of the beauties of nature, who, in the train of his four-in-hand, now rolls through the scenes we have attempted to describe, in quest of information, health, or pleasure, or floats steadily towards his object on the artificial waters which have sprung up under the administration of a statesman who has dared to stake his political character on the hazardous issue, is not to suppose that his ancestors traversed those hills or struggled with the same currents with equal facility. The transportation of a single heavy gun was often considered equal to a victory gained, if happily the difficulties of the passage had not so far separated it from its necessary concomitant, the ammunition, as to render it no more than a useless tube of unwieldy iron. The evils of this state of things pressed heavily on the fortress of the resolute Scotsman who now defended William Henry. Though his adversity neglected the hills, he had planted his batteries with judgment on the plain, and caused them to be served with vigor and skill. Against this assault, the besieged could only oppose the imperfect and hasty preparations of a fortress in the wilderness. It was in the afternoon of the 5th day of the siege, and the 4th of his own service in it, that Major Hayward profited by a parley that had just been beaten by repairing to the ramparts of one of the water bastions to breathe the cool air from the lake and to take a survey of the progress of the siege. He was alone, if the solitary sentinel who paced the mound be excepted, for the artillerists had hastened also to profit by the temporary suspension of their arduous duties. The evening was delightfully calm, and the light air from the limpid water fresh and soothing. It seemed as if with the termination of the roar of artillery and the plunging of shot, nature had also seized the moment to assume her mildest and most captivating form. The sun poured down his parting glory on the scene, without the oppression of those fierce rays that belong to the climate and the season. The mountains looked green and fresh and lovely, tempered with the milder light, or softened in shadow, as thin vapors floated between them and the sun. The numerous islands rested on the bosom of the Horican, some low and sunken, as if embedded in the waters, and others appearing to hover about the element, in little hillocks of green velvet, among which the fishermen of the beleaguering army peacefully rowed their skiffs, or floated at rest on the glassy mirror in quiet pursuit of their employment. The scene was at once animated and still. All that pertained to nature was sweet or simply grand, while those parts which depended on the temper and movements of man were lively and playful. 2 little spotless flags were abroad, the one on a salient angle of the fort, and the other on the advanced battery of the besiegers, emblems of the truth which existed, not only to the axe, but it would seem also to the enmity of the combatants. Behind these again swung, heavily opening and closing in silken folds, the rival standards of England and France. 100 gay and thoughtless young Frenchmen were drawing a net to the pebbly beach, within dangerous proximity to the sullen but silent cannon of the fort, while the eastern mountain was sending back the loud shouts and gay merriment that attended their sport. Some were rushing eagerly to enjoy the aquatic games of the lake, and others were already toiling their way up the neighboring hills, with the restless curiosity of their nature. To all these sports and pursuits, those of the enemy who watched the besieged, and the besieged themselves, were, however, merely the idle though sympathizing spectators. Here and there a picket had indeed raised a song or mingled in a dance, which had drawn the dusky savages around them from their lairs in the forest. In short, everything wore rather the appearance of a day of pleasure than of an hour stolen from the dangers and toil of a bloody and vindictive warfare. Duncan had stood in a musing attitude contemplating this scene a few minutes when his eyes were directed to the glacis in front of the sallyport already mentioned by the sound of approaching footsteps. He walked to an angle of the bastion and beheld the scout advancing under the custody of a French officer to the body of the fort. The countenance of Hawkeye was haggard and careworn, and his air dejected, as though he felt the deepest degradation at having fallen into the power of his enemies. He was without his favorite weapon, and his arms were even bound behind him with thongs made of the skin of a deer. The arrival of flags to cover the messengers of summons had occurred so often of late that when Hayward first threw his careless glance on this group, he expected to see another of the officers of the enemy, charged with a similar office, but the instant he recognized the tall person and still sturdy, though downcast features of his friend, the woodsman, he started with surprise and turned to descend from the bastion into the bosom of the work. The sounds of other voices, however, caught his attention and for a moment caused him to forget his purpose. At the inner angle of the mound he met the sisters, walking along the parapet in search, like himself, of air and relief from confinement. They had not met from that painful moment when he deserted them on the plain, only to assure their safety. He had parted from them worn with care and jaded with fatigue. He now saw them refreshed and blooming, though timid and anxious. Under such an inducement it will cause no surprise that the young man lost sight for a time of other objects in order to address them. He was, however, anticipated by the voice of the ingenuous and youthful Alice.
"Ah, thou tyrant, thou recreant knight, he who abandons his damsels in the very lists!" she cried. "Here we have been days, nay ages, expecting you at our feet, imploring mercy and forgetfulness of your craven backsliding, or I should rather say back-running, for verily you fled in the manner that no stricken deer, as our worthy friend the scout would say, could equal."
"You know that Alice means our thanks and our blessings," added the graver and more thoughtful Cora.
"In truth, we have little wonder why you should so rigidly absent yourself from a place where the gratitude of the daughters might receive the support of a parent's thanks."
Your father himself could tell you that, though absent from your presence, I have not been altogether forgetful of your safety," returned the young man. "The mastery of yonder village of huts," pointing to the neighboring entrenched camp, "has been keenly disputed, and he who holds it is sure to be possessed of this fort, and that which it contains. My days and nights have been all passed here, since we separated, because I thought that duty called me thither, but," he added, with an air of chagrin which he endeavored, though unsuccessfully, to conceal, "had I been aware that what I then believed a soldier's conduct could be so construed, shame would have been added to the list of reasons."
"Hayward!
Duncan!" exclaimed Alice, bending forward to read his half-averted countenance until a lock of her golden hair rested on his flushed cheek and nearly concealed the tear that had started to her eye.
"Did I think this idle tongue of mine had pained you, I would silence it forever. Cora can say, if Cora would, how justly we have prized your service, and how deep, I had almost said how fervent, is our gratitude."
"And will Cora attest the truth of this?" cried Duncan, suffering the cloud to be chased from his countenance by a smile of open pleasure. "What says our graver sister? Will she find an excuse for the neglect of the knight in the duty of a soldier?" Cora made no immediate answer, but turned her face toward the water, as if looking on the sheet of the Horican. When she did bend her dark eyes on the young man, they were yet filled with an expression of anguish that at once drove every thought but that of kind solicitude from his mind. "You are not well, dearest Miss Monroe," he exclaimed. "We have trifled while you are in suffering."
"'Tis nothing,"
she answered, refusing his support with feminine reserve.
"That I cannot see the sunny side of the picture of life, like this artless but ardent enthusiast," she added, laying her hand lightly but affectionately on the arm of her sister, "is the penalty of experience and perhaps the misfortune of my nature. See," she continued, as if determined to shake off infirmity and the sense of duty, "look around you, Major Hayward, and tell me what a prospect is this for the daughter of a soldier whose greatest happiness is his honor and his military renown."
"Neither ought nor shall be tarnished by circumstances over which he has no control," Duncan warmly replied. "But your words recall to me my own duty. I go now to your gallant father to hear his determination in matters of the last moment to the defense. God bless you in every fortune, noble Cora, I may and must call you." She frankly gave him her hand, though her lip quivered, and her cheeks gradually became of ashy paleness. "In every fortune, I know you will be an ornament, an honor to your sex. Alice, adieu." His voice changed from admiration to tenderness.
"Adieu, Alice.
We shall meet soon again as conquerors, I trust, and amid rejoicings." Without waiting for an answer from either, the young man threw himself down the grassy steps of the bastion, and moving rapidly across the parade, he was quickly in the presence of their father. Monroe was pacing his narrow apartment with a disturbed air and gigantic strides as Duncan entered. "You have anticipated my wishes, Major Hayward," he said. "I was about to request this favor."
"I am sorry to see, sir, that the messenger I so warmly recommend has returned in the custody of the French. I hope there is no reason to distrust his fidelity?"
"The fidelity of the long rifle is well known to me," returned Monroe, "and is above suspicion, though his usual good fortune seems at last to have failed. Montcalm has got him, and with the accursed politeness of his nation, he has sent him in with a doleful tale of knowing how I valued the fellow. He could not think of retaining him. A Jesuitical way, that. Major Duncan Hayward, of telling a man of his misfortunes."
"But the general and his succor?"
"Did ye look to the south as ye entered, and could ye not see them?" said the old soldier, laughing bitterly. "Hoot! Hoot! You're an impatient boy, sir, and cannot give the gentlemen leisure for their march."
"They are coming, then? The scout has said as much?"
"What? When? And by what path? For the dunce has admitted to tell me this. There is a letter, it would seem, too, and that is the only agreeable part of the matter, for the customary attentions of our Marquis of Montcalm. I warrant me, Duncan, that ye of Lothian would buy a dozen such marquisates if the news of the letter were bad. The gentility of this French monsieur would certainly compel him to let us know it."
"He then keeps the letter while he releases the messenger?"
"Aye, that he does, and for all the sake of what you call your bon ami. I would venture, if the truth were known, the fellow's granddaughter taught the noble science of dancing."
"But what says the scout? He has
eyes and ears and a tongue. What verbal report does he make?" "Oh, sir, he is not wanting in natural organs, and he's free to tell all that he has seen and heard. The whole amount is this. There is a fort of His Majesty's on the banks of the Hudson called Edward, in honour of His Gracious Highness of York, you'll know, and it is well filled with armed men, as such a work should be."
"But there was no movement, no sign of any intention to advance our relief?"
"There were the morning and evening parades, and when one of the provincial loons, you'll know, Duncan, you're half a Scotsman yourself, when one of them dropped his powder over the porridge. If it touched the coals, it just burned." Then suddenly, changing his bitter, ironical manner to one more grave and thoughtful, he continued, "And yet there might, it must be, something in that letter which it would be well to know." "Our decision should be speedy," said Duncan, gladly availing himself of the change of humor to press the more important objects of their interview. I cannot conceal from you, sir, that the camp will not be much longer tenable, and I am sorry to add that things appear no better in the fort. More than half the guns are bursted. And how should it be otherwise? Some were fished from the bottom of the lake. Some have been rusted in the woods since the discovery of the country. Some were never guns at all, mere privateersmen's things. Do you think, sir, that you can have Woolwich Warren in the midst of a wilderness 3,000 miles from Great Britain? The walls are crumbling about our ears, and provisions began to fail us, continued Hayward, without regarding the new burst of indignation. Even the men show signs of discontent and alarm.
Major Hayward, said Monroe, turning to his youthful associate with the dignity of his years and superior rank.
I should have served His Majesty for half a century, and earned these grey hairs in vain, were I ignorant of all you say, and of the present nature of our circumstances. Still, there is everything due to the honour of the King's arms, and something to ourselves. While there is hope of succour, this fortress I will defend, though it to be done with pebbles gathered on the lake shore. It is a sight of the letter, therefore, that we want, that we may know the intentions of the man of the Earl of Loudon has left among us as his substitute. And can I be of service in the matter? Sir, you can. The Marquis of Montcalm has, in addition to his other civilities, invited me to a personal interview between the works and his own camp, in order, as he says, to impart some additional information. Now, I think it would be wise to show any undue solicitude to meet him, and I would implore you as an officer of rank as my substitute, for it would but ill comport with the honour of Scotland to let it be said one of our gentlemen was outdone in civility by a native of any other country on earth.
Without assuming the supererogatory task of entering into a discussion of the comparative merits of national courtesy, Duncan cheerfully assented to supply the place of the veteran in the approaching interview. A long and confidential communication now succeeded, during which the young man received some additional insight into his duty, from the experience and native acuteness of his commander, and then the former took his leave. As Duncan could only act as a representative of the commandant of the fort, the ceremonies which should have accompanied a meeting between the heads of the adverse forces were, of course, dispensed with. The truce still existed, and with a roll and beat of the drum, and covered by a little white flag, Duncan left the Sallyport within 10 minutes after his instructions were ended. He was received by the French officer in advance with the usual formalities, and immediately accompanied to a distant marquee of the renowned soldier who led the forces of France. The general of the enemy received the youthful messenger surrounded by his principal officers and by a swarthy band of the native chiefs who had followed him to the field. With the warriors of their several tribes, Hayward paused short when, in glancing his eyes rapidly over the dark group of the latter, he beheld the malignant countenance of Magua, regarding him with the calm but sullen attention which marked the expression of that subtle savage. A slight exclamation of surprise even burst from the lips of the young man, but instantly, recollecting his errand, and the presence in which he stood, he suppressed every appearance of emotion, and turned to the hostile leader, who had already advanced a step to meet him. The Marquis of Montcalm was, at the period of which we write, in the flower of his age, and it may be added, in the zenith of his fortunes. But even in that enviable situation he was affable, and distinguished as much for his attention to the forms of courtesy as for that chivalrous courage which only 2 short years afterwards induced him to throw away his life on the plains of Abraham. Duncan, in turning his eyes from the malign expression of Magua, suffered them to rest with pleasure on the smiling and polished features and the noble military air of the French general.
"Monsieur," said the latter, "j'ai beaucoup de plaisir à... Bah! Oui, c'est interprété?" "Je crois, monsieur, qu'il ne sert pas nécessaire," Hayward modestly replied. "Je parle un peu français." "Ah, je suis un bien, est-ce? said Montcalm, taking Duncan familiarly by the arm and leading him deep into the marquee, a little out of earshot. Je déteste ces fripons-là. On ne sait jamais sur quel pied on est avec eux. Eh bien, monsieur, he continued, still speaking in French. Though I should have been proud of receiving your commandant, I am very happy that he has seen proper to employ an officer so distinguished, and who, I am sure, is so amiable as yourself. Duncan bowed low, pleased with the compliment, in spite of a most heroic determination to suffer no artifice to allure him into forgetfulness of the interest of his prince, and Montcalm, after a pause of a moment, as if to collect his thoughts, proceeded. Your commandant is a brave man, and well qualified to repel my assault. My monsieur, it is not time to begin to take more counsel of humanity and less of your courage. The one as strongly characterizes the hero as the other. We consider the qualities as inseparable, returned Duncan, smiling. But while we find in the vigor of your excellency every motive to stimulate the one, we can, as yet, see no particular call for the exercise of the other. Montcalm, in his turn, slightly bowed, but it was with the air of a man too practiced to remember the language of flattery. After musing a moment, he added, It is possible my glasses have deceived me, and that your works resist our cannon better than I had supposed. You know our force. Our accounts vary, said Duncan carelessly. The highest, however, has not exceeded 20,000 men. The Frenchman bit his lip and fastened his eyes keenly on the other, as if to read his thoughts. Then, with a readiness peculiar to himself, he continued, as if assenting to the truth of an enumeration which quite doubled his army. It is a poor compliment to the vigilance of our soldiers, monsieur, that, do what we will, we could never conceal our numbers. If it were to be done at all, one would believe it might succeed in these woods. Though, you think that too soon to listen to the calls of humanity, he added, smiling archly. I may be permitted to believe that gallantry is not forgotten by one so young as yourself. The daughters of the commandant, I learn, have passed into the fort since it was invested. It is true, monsieur, but so far from weakening our efforts, they set us as an example of courage in their own fortitude, with nothing but resolution necessary to repel so accomplished a soldier as Monsieur de Montcalm. I would gladly trust the defense of William Henry to the elder of those ladies. We have a wise ordinance in our Salique laws, which says, The crown of France shall never degrade the lance to the distaff, said Montcalm, dryly, with a little hauteur, but instantly adding, with his former frank and easy air, As all the nobler qualities of hereditary, I can easily credit you, though, as I said before, courage has its limits, and humanity must not be forgotten. I trust, monsieur, you have come authorized to treat for the surrender of the place? Has your excellency found our defense so feeble as to believe the measure necessary? I should be sorry to have the defense protracted in such a manner as to irritate my dread friends here, continued Montcalm, glancing his eyes at the group of grave and attentive Indians, without attending to the other's questions. I find it difficult, even now, to limit them to the usages of war. Hayward was silent, for a painful recollection of the dangers he had so recently escaped came to his mind, and recalled the images of those defenseless beings who shared in all his sufferings. "C'est monsieur, cela?" said Montcalm, following up the advantage which he conceived he had gained. "Our most formidable when baffled? It is unnecessary to tell you with what difficulty they are restrained in their anger. Eh bien, monsieur, shall we speak of the terms?" I fear your excellency has been deceived as to the strength of William Henry and the resources of its garrison. I have not sat down before Quebec, but in earthen work that is defended by 2,300 gallant men, was the laconic reply. Our mounds are earthen, certainly, nor are they seated on the rocks of Cape Diamond, but they stand on that shore which proved so destructive to Dieskau and his army. And there is also a powerful force within a few hours' march of us, which we account upon as part of our means. Some 6 or 8,000 men, returned Montcalm, with much apparent indifference, whom the leader Wadi judges to be safer in their works than in the field. It was now Hayward's turn to bite his lip with vexation, as the other so coolly alluded to a force which the young man knew to be overrated. Both mused a little while in silence when Montcalm renewed the conversation in a way that showed he believed the visit of his guest was solely to propose terms of capitulation. On the other hand, Hayward began to throw sundry inducements in the way of the French general to betray the discoveries he had made through the intercepted letter. The artifice of neither, however, succeeded, and after a protracted and fruitless interview, Duncan took his leave, favorably impressed with an opinion of the courtesy and talents of the enemy's captain, but as ignorant of what he came to learn as when he arrived. Montcalm followed him as far as the entrance of the Marquis, renewing his invitations to the commandant of the fort to give him an immediate meeting in the open ground between the two armies. There they separated, and Duncan returned to the advanced post of the French, accompanied as before, whence he instantly proceeded to the fort and to the quarters of his own commander. Chapter 16. Before you fight the battle, ope this letter. Lear. Major Hayward found Monroe attended by only his daughters. Alice sat upon his knee, parting the gray hairs on the forehead of the old man with her delicate fingers, and whenever he affected to frown on her trifling, appeasing his assumed anger by pressing her ruby lips fondly to his wrinkled brow. Cora was seated nigh them, a calm and amused looker-on, regarding the wayward movements of her more youthful sister with that species of maternal fondness which characterized her love for Alice. Not only the dangers through which they had passed, but those which still impended above them, appearing to be momentarily forgotten in the soothing indulgence of such a family meeting. It seemed as if they had profited by the short truce to devote an instant to the purest and best affection, the daughters forgetting their fears, and the veteran his cares, in the security of the moment. Of this scene, Duncan, who, in his eagerness to report his arrival, had entered unannounced, stood many moments, an unobserved and delighted spectator, but the quick and dancing eyes of Alice soon caught a glimpse of his figure reflected from a glass, and she sprang, blushing, from her father's knees, exclaiming aloud, "Major Hayward!" "What of the lad?" demanded her father. "I have sent her to crack a little with a Frenchman. Ah, sir, you're young and you're nimble. Away with you, ye baggage, as if there are not troubles enough for a soldier, without having his camp filled with such prattling hussies as yourself." Alice laughingly followed her sister, who instantly led the way from an apartment where she perceived their presence was no longer desirable. Monroe, instead of demanding the result of the young man's mission, paced the room for a few moments with his hands behind his back and his head inclined towards the floor, like a man lost in thought. At length he raised his eyes, glistening with a father's fondness, and exclaimed, "They're a pair of excellent girls, Hayward, and such as anyone may boast of." "You are not now to learn the opinion of your daughters, Colonel Monroe?" "True, lad, true," interrupted the impatient old man. "You were about opening your mind more fully on the matter the day you got in, but I did not think it becoming in an old soldier to be talking of nuptial blessings and wedding jokes when the enemies of his king were likely to be unbidden guests at the feast.
But I was wrong, Duncan boy, and I was wrong there. And I'm now ready to hear what you have to say. Notwithstanding the pleasure your assurance gives me, dear sir, I have just now a message from Montcalm. Let the Frenchman and all his host go to the devil, sir, exclaimed the hasty veteran. He's not yet master of William Henry, nor shall he ever be, provided Webb proves himself the man he should. No, sir, thank heaven we are not yet in such a strait that it can be said Monroe is too pressed to discharge the little domestic duties of his own family. Your mother was the only child of my bosom friend, Duncan, and I'll just give you a hearing, though all the knights of St. Louis were in a body at the Sallyport, with the French saint at their head, crying to speak a word under favour. A pretty degree of knighthood, sir, is that which can be bought with sugar hogsheads. And then your twopenny marquisates. The thistle is the order for dignity, antiquity, the veritable nemo me impune necessit of chivalry. You had ancestors in that degree, Duncan, and they were an ornament to the nobles of Scotland.
Hayward, who perceived that his superior took a malicious pleasure in exhibiting his contempt for the message of the French general, was fain to humour a spleen that he knew would be short-lived. He therefore replied with as much indifference as he could assume on such a subject. My request, as you know, sir, went so far as to presume to the honour of being your son.
Aye, boy, you found words to make yourself very plainly comprehended, but let me ask, sir, have you been as intelligible to the girl?
On my honour, no, exclaimed Duncan warmly. There would have been an abuse of confided trust had I taken advantage of my situation for such a purpose.
Your notions are those of a gentleman, Major Hayward, and well enough to their place, but Cora Monroe is maiden too discreet, and of a mind too elevated and proved to need the guardianship even of a father.
Cora!
Aye, Cora! We're talking of your pretensions to Miss Monroe, are we not, sir? I was not conscious of having mentioned her name, said Duncan, stammering. And to marry whom, then, did you wish my consent, Major Hayward? Demanded the old soldier, erecting himself in the dignity of offended feeling. You have another and not less lovely child.
Alice! Exclaimed the father, in an astonishment equal to that which Duncan had just repeated the name of her sister.
Such was the direction of my wishes, sir.
The young man awaited in silence the result of the extraordinary effect produced by a communication which, as it now appeared, was so unexpected. For several minutes Monroe paced the chamber with long and rapid strides, his rigid features working convulsively, and every faculty seeming absorbed in the musings of his own mind. At length he paused directly in front of Hayward, and riveting his eyes upon those of the other, he said, with a lip that quivered violently,
Duncan Hayward, I have loved you for the sake of him whose blood is in your veins. I have loved you for your own good qualities, and I have loved you because I thought you would contribute to the happiness of my child. But all this love would turn to hatred were I assured that what I so much apprehend is true.
God forbid that any act or thought of mine should lead to such a change, exclaimed the young man, whose eye never quailed under the penetrating look it encountered. Without adverting to the impossibility of the other's comprehending those feelings were hidden in his own bosom, Monroe suffered himself to be appeased by the unaltered countenance he met, and with a voice sensibly softened, he continued,
You'd be my son, Duncan, and you're ignorant of the history of a man you wish to call your father. Sit ye down, young man, and I will open you to the wounds of a scared heart in as few words as may be suitable.
By this time the message of Montcalm was as much forgotten by him who bore it as by the man for whose ears it was intended. Each drew a chair, and while the veteran communed a few moments with his own thoughts, apparently in sadness, the youth suppressed his impatience in a look and attitude of respectful attention. At length the former spoke.
You'll know already, Major Hayward, that my family was both ancient and honourable, commenced the Scotsman, though it might not altogether be endowed with that amount of wealth that should correspond with its degree. I was maybe such as one of yourself when I plighted my faith to Alice Graham, the only child of a neighbouring laird of some estate, but the connection was disagreeable to her father, on more accounts than my poverty. I did, therefore, what an honest man should, restored the maiden her troth, and departed the country in the service of my king. I had seen many regions, and had shed much blood in different lands before duty called me to the islands of the West Indies. There it was my lot to form a connection with one who in time became my wife, and the mother of Corda. She was the daughter of a gentleman of those isles, by a lady whose misfortune it was, if you will, said the old man proudly, to be descended remotely from that unfortunate class who were so basely enslaved to administer to the wants of a luxurious people. Ay, sir, that is a curse, entailed on Scotland by your unnatural union with a foreign and trading people. But could I find a man amongst them who would dare to reflect on my child, he should feel the weight of my father's anger. Ah, Major Hayward, you are yourself born at the south, where those unfortunate beings are considered of a race inferior to your own. "'Tis most unfortunately true, sir," said Duncan, unable any longer to prevent his eyes from sinking to the floor in embarrassment. "And you cast it on my child as a reproach! You scorn to mingle the blood of the Haywards with one so degraded, lovely and virtuous though she may be," fiercely demanded the jealous parent. "Heaven protect me from such a prejudice so unworthy of my reason," returned Duncan, at the same time conscious of such a feeling, and that as deeply rooted as if it had been engrafted in his nature. "The sweetness, the beauty, the witchery of your younger daughter, Colonel Munro, might explain my motives without imputing to me this injustice." "You are right, sir," returned the old man, again changing his tones to those of a gentleness, or rather softness. "The girl is the image of what her mother was at her years, and before she had become acquainted with grief. When death deprived me of a wife, I returned to Scotland, enriched by the marriage, and would you think it, Duncan, the suffering angel had remained in the heartless state of celibacy 20 long years, and that for the sake of a man who could forget her. She did more, sir. She overlooked my want of faith, and all difficulties being now removed, she took me for her husband." "And what became the mother of Alice?" exclaimed Duncan, with an eagerness that might have proved dangerous at a moment when the thoughts of Munro were less occupied than at present. "She did indeed," said the old man, "and dearly did she pay for the blessing she bestowed. But she is a saint in heaven, sir, and it ill becomes one who rests on the grave to mourn a lot so blessed. I had her but a single year, though, a short term of happiness for one who had seen her youth fade in hopeless pining." There was something so commanding in the distress of the old man that Hayward did not dare to venture a syllable of consolation. Munro sat utterly unconscious of the other's presence, his features exposed and working with the anguish of his regrets, while heavy tears fell from his eyes and rolled unheeded from his cheeks to the floor. At length he moved, and, as if suddenly recovering his recollection when he arose, and taking a single turn across the room, he approached his companion with an air of military grandeur and demanded, "Have you not, Major Hayward, some communication that I should hear from the Marquis de Montcalm?" Duncan started in his turn and immediately commenced, in an embarrassed voice, the half-forgotten message. It is unnecessary to dwell upon the evasive though polite manner with which the French general had eluded every attempt of Hayward to worm from him the purport of the communication he had proposed making, or on the decided, though still polished message by which he now gave his enemy to understand that, unless he chose to receive it in person, he should not receive it at all. As Munro listened to the detail of Duncan, the excited feelings of the father gradually gave way before the obligations of his station, and when the other was done, he saw before him nothing but the veteran, swelling with the wounded feelings of a soldier. "Yes, said enough, Major Hayward," exclaimed the angry old man. "Enough to make a volume of commentary on French civility. Thereas this gentleman invited me to a conference, and when I sent him a capable substitute for you're all that, Duncan, though your years are but few, he answers me with a riddle." "He may have thought less favourably of the substitute, my dear sir, and you will remember that the invitation, which he now repeats, was to the commandant of the works and not to his second." Well, sir, is not a substitute cloth with all the power and dignity of him who grants the commission. He wishes to confer with Monroe. Faith, sir, I have much inclination to indulge the man, if it should only be to let him behold the firm countenance we maintain, in spite of his numbers and his summons. There might not be bad policy in such a stroke, young man.
Duncan, who believed it of the last importance that they should speedily come to the contents of the letter borne by the scout, gladly encouraged this idea. Without doubt, he could gather no confidence by witnessing our indifference, he said.
You never said a truer word. I could wish, sir, that he would visit the works in open day, and in the form of a storming party. That is the least failing method of proving the countenance of an enemy, and would be far preferable to the battering system he has chosen. The beauty and manliness of warfare has been deformed, Major Hayward, by the arts of your Monsieur Vauban. Our ancestors are far above such scientific cowardice.
It may be very true, sir, but we are now obliged to repel art by art. What is your pleasure in the matter of the interview?
I will meet the Frenchman, in that without fear or delay. Promptly, sir, as becomes a servant of my royal master. Go, Major Hayward, and give them a flourish of the music. Send out a messenger to let them know who is coming. We'll follow with a small guard, for such respect is due to one who holds the honour of his king in keeping. And harkee, Duncan, he added in a half-whisper, though they were alone, it may be prudent to have some aid at hand in case there should be treachery at the bottom of it all.
The young man availed himself of this order to quit the apartment, and as the day was fast coming to a close, he hastened without delay to make the necessary arrangements. A very few minutes only were necessary to parade a few files and to dispatch an orderly with a flag to announce the approach of the commandant of the fort. When Duncan had done both these, he led the guard to the sally-port near which he had found his superior, ready, waiting his appearance. As soon as the usual ceremonials of a military departure were observed, the veteran and his more youthful companion left the fortress, attended by the escort. They had proceeded only 100 yards from the works when the little array which attended the French general to the conference was seen issuing from the holloway which formed the bed of a brook that ran between the batteries of the besiegers and the fort. From the moment that Monroe left his own works to appear in front of his enemies, his air had been grand, and his step and countenance highly military. The instant he caught a glimpse of the white plume that waved in the hat of Montcalm, his eye lighted, and age no longer appeared to possess any influence over his vast and still muscular person.
"Speak to the boys to be watchful, sir," he said in an undertone to Duncan, "and to look well to their flints and steel, for one is never safe with a servant of these Louis. At the same time, we shall show them the front of men in deep security. You'll understand me, Major Hayward."
He was interrupted by the clamor of a drum from the approaching Frenchman, which was immediately answered, when each party pushed an orderly in advance bearing a white flag, and the wary Scotsman halted with his guard close at his back. As soon as this slight salutation had passed, Montcalm moved toward them with a quick but graceful step, baring his head to the veteran, and dropping his spotless plume nearly to the earth in courtesy. If the air of Monroe was more commanding and manly, it wanted both the ease and insinuating polish of that of the Frenchman. Neither spoke for a few moments, each regarding the other with curious and interested eyes. Then, as became his superior rank and the nature of the interview, Montcalm broke the silence. After uttering the usual words of greeting, he turned to Duncan and continued with a smile of recognition, speaking always in French.
"I am rejoiced, monsieur, that you have given us the pleasure of your company on this occasion. There will be no necessity to employ an ordinary interpreter, for in your hands I feel the same security as if I spoke your language myself."
Duncan acknowledged the compliment when Montcalm, turning to his guard, which, in imitation of that of their enemies, pressed close upon him, continued,
"In derrière, mes enfants, il flashot, retirez-vous un peu."
Before Major Hayward would imitate the proof of confidence, he glanced his eyes around the plain and beheld, with uneasiness, the numerous dusky groups of savages who looked out from the margin of the surrounding woods, curious spectators of the interview. Monsieur de Montcalm will readily acknowledge the difference in our situation, he said, with some embarrassment, pointing at the same time toward those dangerous foes, who were to be seen in almost every direction. Were we to dismiss our guard, we should stand here at the mercy of our enemies.
Monsieur, you have the plighted faith of un gentleman français for your safety, replied Montcalm, laying his hand impressively on his heart. It should suffice.
It shall. Fall back, Duncan added to the officer who led the escort. Fall back, sir, beyond hearing, and wait for orders. Munro witnessed this movement with manifest uneasiness, nor did he fail to demand an instant explanation. Is it not our interest, sir, to betray no distrust? Retorted Duncan. Monsieur de Montcalm pledges his word for our safety, and I have ordered the men to withdraw a little in order to prove how much we depend on his assurance. Yeah, it may be all right, sir, but I have no overweening reliance on the faith of these marquesses, or marquis as they call themselves. Their patents of nobility are too common to be certain that they bear the seal of true honor. You forget, dear sir, that we confer with an officer, distinguished alike in Europe and America for his deeds, for from a soldier of his reputation we can have nothing to apprehend. The old man made a gesture of resignation, though his rigid features still betrayed his obstinate adherence to a distrust, which he derived from a sort of hereditary contempt of his enemy, rather than from any present signs which might warrant so uncharitable a feeling. Montcalm waited patiently until this little dialogue in dim voice was ended, when he drew nigher and opened the subject of their conference.
I have solicited this interview from your superior, monsieur, he said, because I believe he will allow himself to be persuaded that he has already done everything which is necessary for the honor of his prince, and will now listen to the admonitions of humanity. I will forever bear testimony that his resistance has been gallant, and was continued as long as there was hope.
When this opening was translated to Munro, he answered with dignity, but with sufficient courtesy. However I prize such testimony from Monsieur Montcalm, it will be more valuable when it shall be better merited. The French general smiled as Duncan gave him the purport of this reply and observed,
"Was he now so freely accorded to approve courage, may be refused to useless obstinacy. Monsieur wish to see my camp, and witness for himself our numbers, and the impossibility of his resisting them with success."
"I know that the King of France is well served," returned the unmoved Scotsman, as soon as Duncan ended his translation. "But my own royal master has as many and as faithful troops."
"Though not at hand, fortunately for us," said Montcalm, without waiting in his ardor for the interpreter. "There is a destiny in war to which a brave man knows how to submit with the same courage that he faces his foes."
Had I been conscious that Monsieur Montcalm was a master of the English, I should have spared myself the trouble of so awkward a translation, said the vexed Duncan dryly, remembering instantly his recent play-by-play with Munro.
"Your pardon, monsieur,"
rejoined the Frenchman, suffering a slight color to appear on his dark cheek.
"There is a vast difference between understanding and speaking a foreign tongue. You will, therefore, please to assist me still."
Then after a short pause he added,
"These hills afford us every opportunity of reconnoitering your works, messieurs, and I am possibly as well acquainted with their weak condition as you can be yourselves."
"Ask the French general if his glasses can reach to the Hudson," said Munro proudly, "and if he knows when and where to expect the army of Webb."
"Is that General Webb be his own interpreter?"
returned the politic Montcalm, suddenly extending an open letter toward Munro as he spoke.
"You will there learn, monsieur, that his movements are not likely to prove
embarrassing to my army. The veteran seized the offered paper without waiting for Duncan to translate the speech, and with an eagerness that betrayed how important he deemed its contents. As his eye passed hastily over the words, his countenance changed from its look of military pride to one of deep chagrin. His lips began to quiver, and suffering the paper to fall from his hand, he dropped his head upon his chest, like that of a man whose hopes were withered as a single blow. Duncan caught the letter from the ground, and without apology for the liberty he took, he read at a glance its cool purport. Their common superior, so far from encouraging them to resist, advised a speedy surrender, urging in the plainest language as a reason the utter impossibility of his sending a single man to their rescue. "Here is no deception!" exclaimed Duncan, examining the billet both inside and out. "This is the signature of Webb, and must be the captured letter."
"The man has betrayed me," Monroe at length bitterly exclaimed. "He has brought dishonor to the door of one where disgrace was never before known to well, and shame has he heaped heavily on my grey hairs."
"Say not so," cried Duncan. "We are yet masters of our fort, and of our honor. Let us then sell our lives at such a rate as shall make our enemies believe their purchase too dear."
"Boy, I thank thee," exclaimed the old man, rousing himself from his stupor. "Ye have for once reminded Monroe of his duty. We will go back and dig our graves behind these ramparts."
"Messieurs," said Montcalm, advancing towards them in a step in generous interest.
"You little know Louis de Savavarin, if you believe him capable of profiting by this letter to humble, brave men, or to build up a dishonest reputation for himself. Listen to my terms before you leave me." "What says the Frenchman?" demanded the veteran sternly. "Does he make a merit of having captured a scout with a note from headquarters? Sir, he had better raise the siege, to go and sit down before Edward if he wishes to frighten his enemies with words."
Duncan explained the other's meaning.
"Monsieur de Montcalm, we will hear you," the veteran added, more calmly, as Duncan ended. "To retain the fort is now impossible," said his liberal enemy. "It is necessary to the interests of my master that it should be destroyed. But as for yourselves and your brave comrades, there is no privilege dear to a soldier that still shall be denied." "Our colors," demanded Hayward. "Carry them to England and show them to your king." "Our arms." "Keep them. None can use them better." "Our march, the surrender of the place, shall all be done in the way most honorable to yourselves." Duncan now turned to explain these proposals to the commander, who had heard him with amazement and a sensibility that was deeply touched by so unusual and unexpected generosity. "Go ye, Duncan," he said. "Go as his marquis, as indeed marquises should be. Go to his marquis and arrange it all. I have lived to see two things in my old age I never did I expect to behold. An Englishman afraid to support a friend, and a Frenchman too honest to profit by his advantage." So saying, the veteran again dropped his head to his chest and returned slowly towards the fort, exhibiting, by the dejection of his air, to the anxious garrison, a harbinger of evil tidings. From the shock of this unexpected blow, the haughty feelings of Monroe never recovered, but from that moment there commenced a change in his determined character, which accompanied him to a speedy grave. Duncan remained to settle the terms of the capitulation. He was seen to re-enter the works during the first watches of the night, and immediately after a private conference with the commandant, to leave them again. It was then openly announced that hostilities must cease,
Monroe having signed a treaty by which the place was to be yielded to the enemy with the morning, the garrison to retain their arms, their colors, and their baggage, and consequently, according to military opinion, their honor.